Can you hear me okay? Is that better? Because for almost 200 years, I'm fine. For something like 200 years, incredibly varied groups of women, illustrious women, very influential women, many of them have lived very close to Washington Square. And I think it's an interesting question to mull over. Why? What is it about Washington Square? Well, I have three possible answers after thinking about it a bit myself. One is there was never any group that controlled all of that part of the village. There was often one group that lived at the north part of the park, another on the east side, another on the south side. So there was nobody who could say, you don't belong here. And I think that's one reason. Another reason is that people of means maybe moved in and then moved out, which meant there was somewhat affordable housing for creative people who didn't have a lot of money. And I think the third reason that at least I've come up with is that there were, excuse me, a number of institutions that I'll be talking about that brought people together, provided support for them. And perhaps this will inspire you to some answers to that question yourself. So, it's really quite a small neighborhood. This is the village of Washington. And then you all know where Washington Square is. I don't have to point that out, but it's just a very tiny place. Now, some of the first people who moved here moved into these houses of Washington Square North in 1831. You know, 1624, the city started being settled at the southern tip of the island. By the time of the American Revolution, Canal Street was the northern border of where people were living. In the 1820s, Soho was the most crowded residential neighborhood in town, and the island kept being moved into more of, you can say it that way, when people of means didn't want to be around the crowds, the noise, the clutter, and so they usually moved north first. So in 1833, some of the wealthiest families in the city, women included, moved into these beautiful houses. And they were very interrelated in a number of ways. A lot of the fathers of the families worked in businesses with other people who lived on the block. A lot of the girls went to the same schools. A lot of the mothers of the families visited with one another and discussed their gardens and so on. So these were some of the first people who moved in and stayed for quite a long time. As a matter of fact, a lot of the men predeceased their wives, and so this was called Widow's Row for a number of years of the 19th century. Now, these women were philanthropic to a large extent as well. This is an organization that they joined to help provide first aid kits and other things for Union soldiers during the Civil War. So it's kind of interesting that you'll see people of means and people impecunious often get together to do what they want to achieve, and that's kind of a running theme through all of this. Now, in 1850, 52% of New York was foreign-born. Half had just gotten off the ship from Ireland, a quarter had just gotten off the ship from Germany, and they tended to dock at the Battery. Oh, goodness gracious. There you see Castle Clinton, or as it was then called, Castle Garden, to the left, and that was the immigrant landing station in New York from 1855 to 1890. It's still there today. It's called Castle Clinton, and it's lost its top floor or two. Now, women of means, some of them from Washington Square North, would go right down to Castle Clinton to choose their servants. There was a lot of discrimination against Irish people in New York for more than a generation. From 1700 until the end of the American Revolution, during British New York colonial times, it was illegal to be a practicing Catholic in this so-called liberal city. And that was one reason, I think, a long history of anti-Catholicism in town. But a quarter of the city arrived barely escaping the Irish famine with their lives. And I think the main reason there was so much anti-Irish feeling in New York in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, is that never before had so many poor people arrived at one time. And people tend to fear the poor, as you may have noticed, trying to put them down rather than help them. And so there were very few legal jobs that Irish women could get for more than a generation. One of them was live-in domestic service. Suddenly the middle-class New Yorker, or the upscale New Yorkers of Washington Square North, could afford more servants because the Irish women didn't have a lot of choices. So here they are right at Castle Clinton, and so for many, goodness gracious, for many years, these Irish women would have worked at Washington Square, would have been some of the people you would have seen in the park, maybe taking some of the children from Washington Square North, or those are some of the people. I always like to kind of picture what the city looked like at different times of its history.
Joyce, I'm sorry to interrupt you just one moment. I have a request for more lights turned off. Would that be better for you?
Turned off.
Bear with me just 1 second. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. Thank you, Joyce.
Everybody can take notes, okay? Okay. So actually, the well-to-do of 1833 were not the first residents of Washington Square. The first African Americans come to New York in 1626, 2 years after the Dutch arrive. Some few years later, less than 2 decades later, some of them are given land in the outlying district to farm and provide some of what they grew to the city to the south. So Anthony Portuguese in 1645 basically owned Washington Square Park. And so a lot of blacks lived in the village, and there were certain areas that they lived in, different groups in different areas. They lived along Minetta Street, Minetta Lane, Gay Street, the South Village. In the 1820s, 1830s, the area around Thompson Street and nearby blocks were where the first black Shakespearean theater in the country was. The first black written newspaper was. A lot of black women were seamstresses around that area. And in 1865, the South Village was also known as Little Africa. This is said to be Aunt Sally of Minetta Street, but just look at that gaze and just imagine what might be on her mind. So blacks were there first. Blacks tended to move, especially after the draft riots of 1863 that burned down some of their buildings, tended to move to the West 30s, 40s, and 50s at a time when the Italians were beginning to come in. So what had been Little Africa becomes one of a number of Little Italies in the city. Now, Bohemia. Bohemia comes to the neighborhood in 1850s. And this is one of the first Bohemians. Her name, she came from South Carolina. Almost everybody that I'm going to be talking about came from someplace else. And her name was Jane McElhenney. But her family lost its fortune during the Civil War. What could she do about the only job a woman like her could do was to go to the stage. And she comes up with a very creative name, stage name, Ada Claire. That was her stage name. And Ada Claire, she hung out. Somebody said to her, "What does it mean to be a Bohemian?" She said, "It means I'm not a victim of feeling or good taste." I think we can learn a lot from a lot of these women. She wore her hair cut short. Now, we're not talking the 1920s, we're talking the 1850s. She had a flagrant affair with the composer Louis Moreau Gottschalk, and when she signed into a Paris hotel, she signed the register Miss Claire and Son. Ada Claire. This is Pfaff's, where she used to hang out with the likes of Horace Greeley and Walt Whitman. It was literally an underground underground bar because it was under Bleecker and Broadway. And so these were some of the first really visibly wild women, I would say, who moved to the neighborhood. Now, this was another very popular woman of the 1850s, whose name was Ada Menken, and she was also on the stage. Byron had written a poem that talked about the head Cossack, whose name was Mazeppa. Now, Mazeppa was sort of punished by being tied to a horse that was supposed to gallop all over with him attached. Well, she played that character, and on stage had herself tied to a horse and wearing scanty clothing like you're seeing, and she was warm, she was friendly, and she was incredibly popular. This was part of Bohemia as well. So many literary figures have lived near Washington Square that you might not even know they were in New York. And what you're looking at here is Louisa May Alcott. Of course, she's more associated with Massachusetts, with New England, but her father was Bronson Alcott. He never could support his family. He didn't really think it was up to him to support his family. So at a very young age, Louisa May wrote swashbuckling novels. She wrote under a pen name, A.M. Barnard, and often her characters were females who punished somebody who had humiliated them or treated them badly or thwarted them. These were very popular, and she made a lot of money as A.M. Barnard. And then one day her publisher said, "Why don't you write a book for children?" And Little Women was the next thing she wrote. Her father was staying on McDougal Street in this building. I think it's now owned by NYU Law School. Oh goodness, this is not a building. This is the building. It's across from a couple of notable venues, and she lived in that building in the 1850s. Little Women comes out in 1868, but she got some of her experience in New York. So there were a lot of literary figures who are connected to the neighborhood. This is one of the women who had a lot of money growing up. And I'm going to look at notes because my brain being what it is, I just block out names all the time. People I know very well. Emma Lazarus was brought up on 10th Street off of 5th. And her father was a sugar importer. And she was of a Jewish family whose ancestors came to New York on the first boat of Jewish immigrants, and I'm talking 1654. 23 people who actually came from Brazil after the Portuguese took it over from the Dutch. And so she had a long history. She didn't have much of a Jewish consciousness, except until the 1880s. 1880s, there were terrible pogroms in the Pale of Settlement in Eastern Europe, and she started writing poems about it. When the French offered us the deal of a free Statue of Liberty that the people of France were going to pay $400,000 for, but we had to come up with a base, which was going to cost us $100,000. We almost didn't get the Statue of Liberty. For that reason, she started writing poems to help fundraise for that $100,000. And of course, some of her words, some of the most famous words in America, which for many people is what America is about. The poem is 140 lines long, but give me you're poor, you're tired, you're poor, you know the rest, is inscribed on the base, on the foot of the Statue of Liberty. She died at age 38. She never lived to see. She never saw the statue erected in 1886, and she never knew that around 1905 or so, her words were going to be inscribed on the statue. So one of the other people you might have seen walking around Washington Square. Also, clearly, of money, you're looking at Edith Wharton, and her maiden name was Jones. It was her aunt, Jones, after whom the phrase keeping up with the Joneses came about. Edith Wharton was of society, and she wrote wonderful novels about how society has the power to control people, and especially the life of women. It's not who they are, it's how they manage a household, wearing the right glove, incredibly vivid details in her work. They say about Edith Wharton, she was a failure in Boston. They thought she was too fashionable to be intellectual, but she was a failure in New York. They thought she was too intellectual to be fashionable. She was one of a number of these successful women who ended up divorcing their husbands. So she divorces Teddy and has this love of her life in not very reciprocal arrangement in France. Well, Edna St. Vincent Millay, she was brought up in Maine, goes to Vassar, comes to Greenwich Village, and for many people, writes about the new uninhibited life of Greenwich Village. She wrote poetry, and in 1924 was an actress in the original production of O'Neill's Desire Under the Elms, as was her also gorgeous sister Norma. So for many people, she was the uninhibited new young generation of that particularly pre-World War I period. It's a kind of an interesting story in a Greenwich Village story about her middle name. Right before she was born in Maine, her mother's favorite brother had his life saved at St. Vincent's, the late great St. Vincent's Hospital on 12th Street. And I always liked what she said in later life. She said she was very glad his life had not been saved at Sloan Kettering. Now, Lilla Cather was brought up in the Midwest, and she's working in Pittsburgh. McClure comes by and suggests to her that she come to New York and edit his magazine. McClure's magazine was a very important piece of all of this puzzle of the circa World War I period. He allowed a lot of space for anybody who wanted to write about a social issue. So she comes to Greenwich Village. She has three addresses in the village, and then moves uptown. And she comes to the village to write about Nebraska. She was very taken with the simple courage, solidity of people from Nebraska. But when she was living on Washington Place in a boarding house, she falls in love with the woman who lives in the boarding house, and the woman was her lifelong companion. So possibly the atmosphere of acceptance in the village was one of the reasons she came to the village to write about Nebraska. But what a draw the place has to accomplish that. I always think she had a perfect life for a writer after she became quite successful. She got a Pulitzer Prize for one of her 6 novels. In the morning, she would go to Jefferson Market and buy what she wanted for lunch, and then a French maid would come in and prepare lunch. Something we could model after her also. She also rented the apartment upstairs, so nobody would be walking over her head while she was trying to concentrate. This is Jane Heap. She and her partner lived on 8th Street, and she published something called The Little Review. She had an incredible sense of what was great writing. So she published Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and in the 1920s, Pound told her there's this incredible novel called Ulysses by James Joyce, and she put it out in sections. Now, the Comstock laws, which affect other people also in this talk, like Margaret Sanger in particular, thought that that was sending obscene material through the U.S. mail, which was a jailable offense at that time. So she kept putting it out in her installments while the trial went on. She ended up, the feds burned 4 issues of this installment thing. And she paid her $100 fine, and she kept on publishing Ulysses. So that's how it comes to the United States, through Jane Heap. This is Marianne Moore, a very fine poet, who moves to New York and writes with quite intensity about sort of commonplace things. Baseball was something she was very interested in, and she worked for 7 years in this building. She was an assistant librarian in the Hudson Park branch beginning in 1918. Here she is with her mother. Then they both moved to Brooklyn, and then she moves back as she got a little older. Marianne Moore is the one on the left. Usually she was identifiable because she wore tri-cornered hats a lot, so she had a very distinctive silhouette. This woman came from Iowa, Susan Glassfeld. She and George Crown Cook found the Provincetown Playhouse, which is the building at that time on the right. Of course, the 4 buildings on the left are still standing, although a little bit changed since this picture was taken. Now, in 1915, Glassfeld and others were in Provincetown, Massachusetts, complaining about the theater on Broadway. They said it has no literary merit, it doesn't ask anything of the audience, basically a lot of songs strung together by words. So they tried to put on plays, but they weren't very successful. The next year, up at the Cape, somebody said, doesn't anybody have any plays? And a guy said, I came up here with a 26-year-old fellow, a trunk full of plays he wrote, none of them ever produced. It was Eugene O'Neill. So they put on Bounties for Cardiff up there, and then they moved to McDougal Street in 1916. First, I think 136 McDougal, and then 2 years later, 133 McDougal, all demolished for a fairly new NYU law school building. This is Emily Post, also raised up with means. Her father was a very fine architect, Bruce Price. And in 1904, her husband was going around with a lot of chorus girls, which opened him up to blackmail. She divorces him, and in 1922 she wrote for some magazines, but in 1922 publishes her Complete Etiquette for Society, Politics, Business, and the Home, and was writing for a lot of magazines, did very, very well, and knew which fork to use, clearly. Well, another woman, goodness, what am I doing wrong here, of means is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. She was married, she was the daughter of Cornelius Vanderbilt's grandson, I believe. And she didn't just want to be social, as a number of these well-to-do society women of note were. She wanted to be an artist. She wanted to learn to sculpt. She went to the Art Students League and other schools here and abroad, and wanted to support a lot of the artists who were moving in from all over the United States. And the word was out, Greenwich Village was the place to be if you were a creative person. So she purchases a stable in McDougal Alley and supports a lot of the other artists. Now, this her husband had just inherited $36 million. She marries Harry Payne Whitney, and she wanted to do more than just be social with that fortune. So this is the site on 8th Street of what had been the first Whitney Museum. See, she was collecting the works of living American artists. By 1930, she had collected 700 works, offered the collection to the Metropolitan Museum, who said, living American artists, no thank you. And that's how the Whitney Museum, the first in the country for living American artists, came about. Well, it's moved uptown twice, and on May 1st, it is moving back to the village, as you know, right next to the High, around 12th Street. So if you haven't been in this building, I do recommend that you enter it because it's a wonderful Art Deco interior, and that's where the museum originally was. They welcome your presence because it is an art school now, and they have drawings on the wall that you would like to see, so you might want to check this out if you haven't been inside already. It's 8th Street, about, what, 4 doors west of 5th. It's a very visible pink building. This is what it would have looked like in the 1920s. number of women who brought people together, and possibly the first literary salon in the United States was started by Anne Lynch on Washington Place, just west of the park, in the 1840s. She had taste, she had tact, she was a very smart woman, very intelligent woman, and she got together creative writers and people who might do them some good. So William Cullen Bryant, who lived not far away, Edgar Allan Poe was there, Horace Greeley, with his very influential newspaper, came to her salons. Her husband, whose last name was Botta, B-O-T-T-A, which was also her married name, was the first Italian professor of Italian at NYU. So she also had an NYU connection in that regard. Well, the most famous of the salon mavens in Greenwich Village was, of course, Mabel Dodge. Mabel Dodge also came from money in Buffalo. Her first husband died in an accident. She married another man. They moved to Europe. She lived in Florence, she lived in Paris, and was very friendly with Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo Stein. And loved art, loved creativity. Wasn't a painter or writer herself. And then her husband wanted to move back to America, which she was not in favor of at all. But they rent a floor on 9th Street and 5th, northeast corner, building no longer there, that was the home of the one-legged Civil War General Sickles. And she did not like being in Greenwich Village, but she had a couple of friends, Walter Lippmann and Lincoln Steffens, who suggested that she had people over once a week. One of them suggested that, and the other suggested she should pick a topic, maybe have a speaker, and people who were interested in that topic would come to her house. And that's the start of the Mabel Dodge Salon. Things were spoken in public there that had never been spoken in public in the United States before. Brill talked about Freudianism. Margaret Sanger talked about birth control. Joe Davidson talked about a new kind of art. Big Bill Haywood, who had organized some of the miners in the Southwest, talked about labor unions. And not only were these very new topics for many people, she was good at choosing the living topic, basically what everybody was talking about anyway, but the media ate it up. So newspapers all over the country talked about the shocking talk in a Fifth Avenue brownstone. And what that meant was, this was just before World War I, what that meant was that somebody in Dubuque or some other place said, you know, I belong there, I don't belong where I am, and it hastened people coming to Greenwich Village for creative support and identity, I guess. But here she is. She had an affair with John Reed, and then he leaves her and goes to the Russian Revolution, I guess. Then with that, when they break up, she goes to Taos and starts the art colony in Taos as well, and marries Toby Lucan. She becomes Mabel Dodge Lucan, and a very interesting woman who was very good at getting people talking and feeling comfortable. There's an interesting woman, a Unitarian minister, whose name I know so well. I can't believe how well I know her name as far as it is. It is definitely a function of something or what. It will come to me, I'm sure. Anyway, her husband was running Ellis Island at the time, and she started Marie Jenny Howe, thank you so much, Jenny-N-N-E-Y Howe. And in 1912, she starts a club. It was called a Unique Luncheon Club for Unorthodox Women. Doesn't that sound like fun? Women, mostly, pretty much all of the women had made their own money. They were newspaper journalists, they were photographers, they were lawyers, they were teachers, and they came to talk about their lives. Some of them were radical, some of them were arch conservative, some of them were DAR in their personal lives, some of them were gay women in long relations, some of them were into free love, Some of them were heterosexual women in long or not long relations. And they loved arguing all these different ideas. They discussed all kinds of things. The club was called Heterodoxy. And it met every other week from, except for the summer, from 1912 to the start of World War II. Isn't that an interesting thing? So the youngest member, Agnes de Mille, because the choreographer, because her mother was a member as well. It seems to me that some of the women in this World War I, basically pre-World War I era, did very traditional women's things, but they did it in a different context. So this is a rooming house that used to be at Washington Square South, run by a woman named Madame Blanchard. She had had a rooming house in Syracuse. Her son was an artist. She liked creative people. So there were so many people who came through or lived in her rooming house. It came to be known as Madame Blanchard's House of Genius. Adelina Patti of the Metropolitan Opera was there. Poets, O'Neill came through, but my personal favorite, Rose O'Neill. She was a graphic designer, very successful, and comes up with a new kind of image, the kewpie doll. She invents the kewpie doll. And she does it sort of based on the idea of Cupid. She supports her husband, she supports her whole family until the Depression comes. And then that was the end of that. Her toys are out of favor and everything changes. But here she is. She was basically from Missouri, and the College of the Ozarks is where her archives are. Oh goodness, what's happening here? I know. Thank you. This is Grace Godwin's restaurant at Washington Square South. I love this picture because they're sort of struggling with spaghetti. You know, that came in and everybody had to deal with it. But again, in a kind of a traditional role, a restaurant helping to feed people. But she had she gave special meals for artists, and she had a few little kids that she was trying to support. And when the tourists came, she had her kids go around to all the tables trying to sell things to them. So, you know, she sort of went with the flow. Grace Godwin. And Polly's restaurant was very much part of that MacDougal Street kind of center of things. The Liberal Club was in the building, and Polly's good, cheap food. It had a famous waiter, the anarchist Hippolyte Havel, who was on and off involved with Emma Goldman. And if you sat down and he served you, he would always say, "Take that, you bourgeois pig." Everybody loved it. They came back. If we forgot to say it, they said, "Say it to us." Hippolyte Havel, Polly's. Polly Holiday was from Evanston, Illinois. Just imagine that Greenwich Village, actually, now that I think of it, seems to have emptied the creative people out of much of the east part of the United States. Now this is Mama Bertolotti's, another place to eat, and for 15 cents you could get a thick minestrone soup, good bread, and a glass of wine. Now at the South Village, she was part of the new Italian people coming through. Ellis Island from 1892 to 1924 had 12 million people come to the United States through Ellis Island. 2.5 million of them came from southern Italy. And it was a very hard thing. You might think you're looking at Italy until you see New York post office there. It was very hard, particularly for the women. There was high tuberculosis. People came from farms where you could always get some kind of decent fruit, but in New York, maybe you couldn't. Women often had a lot of pregnancies that made them in a sicker situation as well. I remember when reading a letter that when Judson Church put out ice water in that corner exterior fountain, they got a letter from one of the women of the South Village saying, you know, we're in a sweltering tenement apartment, my baby is sick. You can't imagine how welcome that ice water was. Things we might not even think of as so critical, but it made a difference. people from Italy. What's happening? Oh, I did, okay. So some of the women worked on the streets selling things in push carts. 100 years ago, for 75 cents, you could rent a push cart and sell a little pasta or a pair of socks or an egg. It wasn't until Fiorello LaGuardia, I always think he has the perfect qualifications for having been elected in New York. His mother was Jewish, his father was Catholic, and he was Episcopalian, so it worked out very well. But he thought that push carts were unsanitary, and by the 1940s, he's banning them and very proudly replacing them with indoor markets. But some of the women worked outside, and a lot of the life, especially in the Italian community, is now outside, visible on the street. The sounds are different, and things change with every new group. But one of the things that a lot of the families worked at was things having to do with the garment industry. These were the sweatshops in tenement apartments, and a tenement apartment, you know, from the word tenant, was basically multifamily housing for poor people, and an apartment which might have 12 people living in it, and more people during the day working in it, 325 square feet. Let's picture that. So people worked in the home. This was before the government wanted to or was able to have any rules improving homework. Eventually the feds say you can't work at home because we can't police anything. But I find this a very interesting picture because what they're doing is making flowers for hats. You know, women wore hats, and that was a very big item. But what interests me about this picture is that it looks very different to two sides of a certain question. To the family, to the Italian family, this is a very positive image. They have a trade. They're supporting the family. They are teaching their kids a trade so their kids can support a family. The family, very, very central, especially to the Italian community, is a broad generalization. The kids are not in school because a lot of the public school teachers are Protestants who are very happy to tell Catholic kids what's wrong with being a Catholic kid. And so this is something very good. But to the progressives of the 1890s, 1900s, this is terrible. Those kids should be in school. There should be laws limiting work that should not be in the home. So it always is kind of poignant to think of how if everybody wants the best for the people, what is the best and how do they determine that? Kind of a tricky question. A lot of colleges, or a number of colleges, come to Greenwich Village. This is the original building of NYU. NYU starts in 1831, and 4 years later, on the site of the present main building of NYU at Washington Square East, they build this very Gothic-looking structure. It was called the Gothic Tower. It started with 6 professors with a big chapel in the first floor. And it was the main building of NYU until the 1890s when NYU decides to move their main campus up to the Bronx, which they eventually sell in the 70s. But NYU did not admit women for a very long time. In the 1880s, in the arts program, some few women are allowed to take a course, not for credit, and then eventually they're allowed to take it for credit. In 1890, the School of Pedagogy, the Ed School, begins, and by the next year, 15% of the student body is female. The Heights campus, the western part of University Heights part of the Bronx, which was primarily, I think, known for its very fine engineering school, did not admit women until the 1950s. Today, most of the students of NYU are female. It wasn't until 1939 that the first female full professor was at the college. The law school has been around at NYU, been around since 1835. Women were not allowed in In the 1890s, the school decided, well, maybe we should have a law class for women, not so that they could be lawyers, because that would be ridiculous, but to teach them about the law. And they had a woman who had gotten her law degree from the University of Zurich. She taught 12 sessions of the course, and I know what they paid her for the 12 sessions. Her name was Emily Kempin, $5. Now, they had to write a paper at the end, and a woman who wrote an excellent paper and got an award for it is this woman, Emily Roebling. Her father-in-law, John Roebling, an engineer from Prussia, figured he could build a bridge more than twice as long as the next longest single-span suspension bridge in the world. But John Roebling, 1 month after he gets the go-ahead, dies of lockjaw. It's left to his 32-year-old son, Washington Roebling, to deliver the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, Washington Roebling works on it for a number of years, and then he gets something they have to figure out while they're building it, called the Caisson disease. He was down underwater. If he was on the Manhattan side, it would have been 80 feet under the surface. If he was on the Brooklyn side, about 42 feet. And when he came up, they brought him up slowly, but he could not bear the sound of any voice except that of his wife, Emily Roebling. They lived at Brooklyn Heights. He had a spyglass. He could see what was happening on the bridge. But for 10 years, she went to the bridge, answered all the questions, explained everything, helped her husband, and it was never publicized, her part in this, in order not to ruin her husband's reputation. So when she won this essay at the law school class, her topic was the inequalities of women in marriage. She said, she said the law classes women with infants and lunatics, and people were just shocked. How smart she was. Another school in Greenwich Village, the first female doctor in the country, Elizabeth Blackwell, started it. And just before the Civil War, it was right on Broadway, just below 8th Street. She didn't just, she went to Geneva College, which is now Hobart, and there were 150 male students there. There were no female doctors in the country at that time. And since this was a new idea to have a female student, the president of the college said the 150 students should vote. Should they admit a woman? Well, the men thought that was a hilarious thing. They thought the question had been put up by a competing college. And so they said, yes, let's have the woman. And that's the only way she got into college, and graduated first in her class, and then decided that the women's medical college, so that there could be more women doctors, was a very important thing. And she also provided a number of the first nurses for the Civil War on the Union side. Her brother marries Lucy Stone, another one of the radicals of the period, who said, why should a woman change her last name when she gets married? She disappears, and starts the Lucy Stone League. So that was in the same family. I just remembered Elizabeth Blackwell's brother. Well, the new school starts. The new school here starts in 1919 as adult education, no exams, no grades. It was a pioneer in continuing education. And then in the 1930s, part of it becomes the university in exile for some of the emigres trying to get out of Europe, like Hannah Arendt here, who was a political philosopher and studied power and totalitarianism, and was a great brain who came to the village because of the new school. But the new school welcomed all the different new ideas, anything that they thought people would be interested in. I taught there like 75 times myself while I was teaching at NYU, and there were people studying jazz, and somebody wanted to teach a course in Muhammad Ali, that was okay too. So they were very open. And this is Berenice Abbott, who actually lived on Commerce Street, but also taught at Greenwich Village. And as the city was demolishing many of the buildings and some of the neighborhoods. She photographed what was being lost, so very much in the spirit of the Greenwich Village Society of Historic Preservation, but she wasn't really able to keep things from being demolished, but also a teacher at the New School, as was, but you wish you knew who, Martha Graham. Martha Graham, who changes ballet, classical ballet. She provides a new language, a new format, a new everything. And the New School was where she could talk about it and show it to people. So a lot of interesting ideas were entertained at the New School in those days. What did women work at? Well, what you're looking at here is what was for a number of years, it starts in 1859, the largest department store in the world. A.T. Stewart had started down on Vesey Street. He came from Ireland and had an idea of a store that sold many, many different things. There were just a lot of specialty shops up until that time. And he started on Vesey Street, but he was doing very well. Merchants from all over the world came to see what he did. He didn't pay people a lot, and there were all kinds of rules, and they would be penalized if they were infringements of the rules. But by 1859, he moves to 10th Street and Broadway in the entire block that is now the apartment house, Stewart House, named for him. It's on the same site. And he sold goods from around the world, some wildly expensive, I mean $1,000 scarves in the 1850s and so on. But he, up at the top floor that you're looking at, Stewart is the guy on the left, he had 900 women making some of the products that were sold below. So you might say this is sort of the start of the garment district in the neighborhood. For maybe a century or more, New York's biggest industry was manufacturing clothing. And so here they are upstairs at A.T. Stewart, but again, in people's houses. This is an Italian house, and Campbell suit dolls were made in different places there and other things. So it was toys, it was what people were wearing, all kinds of things like that. And the kids would maybe cut, little kids would be used to cut thread or take something from this side of the room to the other. And there were just no regulations. If you made any little mistake, they wouldn't pay you for what you were doing. And it was very, very difficult, very long hours of work. Here you see more people, looks like in a tenement apartment, working very hard. Now in 1889, down at 50 Broadway, building that's not there any longer, it's now the UFT headquarters site. But for the first time in New York, they build a building with steel girders. And steel girders meant you could build higher than the 11 stories that was the first steel building. In fact, that's 1889. By 1913, you already have the Woolworth building. But what it did for the garment industry was it allowed the owners of the factories to build fireproof buildings. They could use steel, they could get insurance. It was really fabulous for them. So the garment district begins to move from Soho in the South Village to the area just east of Washington Square Park. And they could, goodness gracious, they could just pack them in. It was not very safe. What's happening, Ted? For the people working there, because they were basically fire traps, but the buildings were fireproof. The building wasn't going to fall down, and the owners could get insurance. So the conditions were very bad now that they have real factories, not just sweatshops. It's called sweatshops because they just sweated.